This is Andy Hill from ICMA's Market Practice and Regulatory Policy, and I'm going to provide an update on our work related to CSDR mandatory buy-ins and repo. In this brief presentation, we will discuss what is CSDR, settlement discipline, the mandatory buy-in regime and its scope. We will look at the challenges for firms caught under the buy-in regime and the work that ICMA and others are doing about that, and also the potential implications for repo market functioning and liquidity. So what is CSDR, settlement discipline, mandatory buy-in regime, and its scope? Well, CSD regulation is an EU regulation which introduces measures for the authorization and regulation of EU central securities depositories, CSDs. While much of the regulation focuses on the prudential, organizational, and business standards of CSDs, some of its requirements directly affect trading level entities that settle trades on EU CSDs. This includes measures to address settlement fails. Chapter 3 of the regulation deals with settlement discipline. Article 7 provides for measures to address settlement fails. These include cash penalties and mandatory buy-ins. The regulation entered into force in September 2014. However, the settlement discipline measures, including mandatory buy-ins, were originally due to come into force from September 2020, but this will now be February 1st, 2021. It should be noted that this delay is purely technical. So what is the scope of CSDR settlement discipline? Well, it will apply to all transactions intended to settle on an EU CSD in transferable securities, money market instruments, UCITS, and emission allowances that are admitted to trading or traded on a trading venue or cleared by a CCP. This applies to all trading level entities, regardless of their domicile. It is important to note that initiating the CSDR buy-in process is a regulatory requirement. It is no longer a right. And importantly, and unusually, securities financing transactions are in scope. Short-term SFTs, those with terms of 30 business days or less, will be out of scope of the buy-in regime. So what is a CSDR mandatory buy-in? It's executed at the trading level. It is the trading party's responsibility to buy in the failing trading party. So in that respect, it's similar to a conventional buy-in mechanism. For non-centrally cleared trades, it does require the appointment of a buy-in agent, something that is no longer required under ICMA buy-in rules, for instance. The buy-in process is automatically triggered after 4 business days from the intended settlement date in the case of liquid equities, liquid being defined by MIFIR, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, 7 business days for all other instruments, including bonds. This period between the intended settlement date and the regulatory requirement to start the buy-in process is known as the extension period. There is also prescriptive criteria for completing the buy-in, and these must be settled again within 4 business days for liquid equities and 7 business days for all other instruments. By completed, this means appointing the buy-in agent, purchasing the securities, and settling the securities. If a buy-in is not possible, the non-defaulting party can initiate one more attempt. This is called the deferral period. Otherwise, the buy-in will result in cash compensation, where the trade is cashed out at a market reference price. It is also worth noting that the way the regulation is worded, the payment of the buy-in or the cash compensation differential, unlike conventional OTC buy-ins such as the ICMA rules, is asymmetrical, i.e. it can only be paid in one direction, from the failing party to the non-failing party. This has significant risk implications. So what are the challenges facing firms that are caught under the buy-in regime, and what are we at ICMA, with others, doing about it? There are many challenges. The first category of challenges relate to scope and application. Which SFTs are in and out of scope? For instance, currently it would seem that open SFTs are in scope on the basis that they do not have a defined end date, and the exemption for SFTs is based on a defined end date. Also, basket trades, tri-party, DBV, are these in scope? Practical issues, how do you bind an SFT? If you buy in the start leg of an SFT, does that mean you only cancel the start leg, or do you cancel the entire transaction, replacing effectively the borrow of securities with the outright purchase of securities? And if you only cancel the start leg, what happens if that goes to cash compensation? You still have a forward obligation to return securities that you won't actually receive. Margin and collateral movements, are these in scope of the buy-in requirements? Buy-in agents. If you have to find a buy-in agent, but there are no buy-in agents, what happens? Pass-ons. Under the regulation, there is no provision for a pass-on mechanism. Does this mean that where there are transaction chains, a single fail can lead to multiple simultaneous binds? And for cash compensation, how do you establish the appropriate reference price, particularly if this is in a very illiquid security that may not have traded for days, weeks? Your transaction could be the last one. And dispute resolution, where buy-ins are off-market or cash compensation reference prices are disputable, how are these resolved? Then there are challenges around enforceability. Article 25 of the Level 2 requires that all parties in the settlement chain, including trading parties, have contractual arrangements in place to ensure that the regulation and the provisions are enforceable. Also, this has to be in every jurisdiction. So what are the extraterritorial implications, and how is this expected to be applied in non-EU jurisdictions? And how are NCAs expected to monitor whether buy-ins take place or not? And what sanctions will they take in the case that firms are not initiating buy-ins? Then perhaps, and in many ways most importantly from ICMA's perspective, what are the impacts on market liquidity? How will the buy-in regime affect pricing and liquidity provision in bond markets, and also repo securities lending markets? So what is ICMA doing about CSDR buy-ins? Firstly, we are working on updating the GMRA by means of an annex to cover the application of the buy-in regime to in-scope SFTs. More information on this can be found on a separate update link. We are also working in coordination with ISLA to establish market best practice for SFTs in the case of fails. For instance, should firms look to use their contractual provisions, i.e. their mini closeouts, before the end of the extension period rather than going to buy-ins? And if you do go to buy-ins, how do you execute the buy-in? Do you cancel just the start leg? Do you cancel both legs? In March 2020, we published FAQs on CSDR mandatory buy-ins and securities financing transactions. These are intended to outline considerations and, where possible, to provide clarity with respect to the application of CSDR buy-ins in the case of repos and other SFTs. In light of new guidance from ESMA and agreed market practice, we will look to keep these FAQs updated. Again, working with ISLA, we are looking to propose exemptions for certain SFTs. In February, we submitted a Q&A to ESMA requesting level 3 guidance that open and open-like SFTs should be exempted from the buy-in requirements and should be based on their earliest contractual termination date. This would be in line with other regulatory treatments, e.g. LCR or NSFR, as well as general accounting practice. To back up this argument, we conducted a survey of ERCC and ISLA members to find out how they currently treated open SFTs from a regulatory reporting and risk management perspective. which we also shared with ESMA. We also intend to submit a Q&A requesting an exemption for certain basket trades such as tri-party and DBV, where it is entirely impractical to try to execute a buy-in. We're also doing extensive work more generally around bond markets, updating the ICMA buy-in rules, working to address the asymmetric payment provisions contractually, which we also intend to do through the repo annex. We continue to engage in advocacy. This is raising awareness of the scope details and potential implications, in particular for non-EU entities and smaller buy-sides who may not be aware that they could be in scope of this rather extensive regulation. We will also continue advocacy work with regulators and policymakers with a view to delaying and amending the buy-in provisions, which we believe will be extremely harmful for market functioning and liquidity. More recently, the issue of a potential delay due to the COVID-19 crisis has also been raised, and this is something we intend to broach with the authorities. So what are the potential implications for repo market functioning and liquidity? In November 2019, we undertook an extensive survey of our members focused on buy sides, sell sides, and repo and securities lending desks. We wanted to establish what the general preparedness of firms was for the regulation, both from an operational and trading strategy perspective, but also how this was going to impact pricing and liquidity provision across bond markets, but also the impacts for repo and securities lending. In terms of general awareness and preparedness, it should come as little surprise that the market feels there is little awareness. That said, at least in terms of the respondents to the survey, plans are being undertaken to adapt operational processes, which will require extensive work, but maybe less so in terms of adapting risk management and trading behavior. This will have significant implications for risk management and trading behavior. In terms of expected impacts for market liquidity and pricing for repo and securities lending, what we find, and in many ways this mirrors the same feedback for underlying bond markets, the impacts for the more liquid end of securities, so core sovereign bonds, even to an extent periphery sovereign bonds, supras and agencies, the impact isn't going to be that intense in terms of pricing or the willingness to provide repo and securities lending liquidity. However, once we move into the less liquid end of asset class spectrum, we find that there is a lack of willingness to show offers. Either pricing is going to change significantly, or firms will just not look to lend those securities. It's also important to remember that this is not just about in-scope repo and securities lending. Out of scope will be significantly impacted due to the relationship between the repo market and the cash market. If you lend securities and don't get them back, which causes you subsequently to fail on an outright sale, you will be bought in with little recourse against the failing repo. This is a deterrent to lending securities. And this is reflected in the survey responses related to the overall expected impact on SFT market efficiency and liquidity, where overwhelmingly participants expect market liquidity to worsen. We have a significant number of resources related to settlement discipline and in particular the buy-in regime, which can be found on the ICMA website. You may also be interested to join our dedicated working group, which is looking at implementation issues, both for cash bonds and for repo, and also where we are looking to update our buy-in rules, as well as establish best practice for both cash and repo markets. Thank you.